Building the Kingdom of God in Nauvoo, Illinois. Now, the purpose of this lesson, according to the manual, is to teach about how the early saints worked to build the Kingdom of God in Nauvoo and to encourage class members to follow their example. The Nauvoo period was a very short period in the grand scheme of things. It was only 5 or 6 years, but it was a very important period in the life of the church and the development of the church. The Mormon church goes into Nauvoo looking, a lot like other American Protestant sects, but it leaves Nauvoo very differently. Some very distinctive doctrines come out of Nauvoo, which will be the topic of lessons in the next couple of weeks, and so we'll dive deeper into those in coming lessons. But today it's more just Nauvoo in general. So to start off, to talk about Nauvoo, we talk about how they got to Nauvoo. We talked a couple weeks ago about the Mormon War that happened from August to November in 1838, which kind of ended, or got the extermination order came in October, right near the end of that, and a lot of the leaders, the Mormon leaders, Joseph Smith, etc., were imprisoned, put in Liberty Jail, which we also have talked about a couple of times over the last couple of weeks, in November of 1838. And so we have a lot of stuff going on. We have the war, the Mormon War, a bunch of skirmishes going on. Then the extermination order, the leaders go into jail, which kind of puts everything into chaos. You've got thousands of Mormons in Missouri and Ohio, some of them, who are somewhat leaderless. I mean, they do have leaders. There are people there, but Joseph Smith the prophet is in jail. They've just lost this war. They're being run out, and it's pretty much chaos. Where to go? Nobody knows where to go, and there's really nobody there to lead them, to tell them where to go. And so what we see is that throughout the late winter and spring, in January of 1839, thousands of Latter-day Saints are just heading east. They're just getting out of Missouri. There's an extermination order against them, and they've got no real direction, no guidance, and so they're just hightailing it out of there. So there's about a 200-mile trail where there's hundreds of people scattered along it, and it pretty much ends at the Mississippi River. Elizabeth Haven wrote in her journal that in late February, she said, about 12 families cross the river into Quincy every day, and about 30 are constantly at the other side waiting to cross. It is slow and grimy. There is only one ferry boat to cross in. So this is Quincy, Illinois, she's talking about, which is right on the other side of the Mississippi River from Missouri. And you have these people scattered all along this trail, and the trail kind of dead ends at the Mississippi River, and there's one ferry boat there that's taking families and groups across at the rate of about 12 a day. The weather has a big impact on that. It's winter time. There's ice flowing up and down, or ice flowing on the Mississippi River. Occasionally it gets cold enough that the river freezes over, at which time it's kind of like, everybody just tries to run across. They're just trying to get out of Missouri, right? And in Quincy, it's a town of about 1,200 people. The Mormons found friends. I mean, the Quincy residents were sympathetic to their plight. Many of them opened their homes, provided jobs. They had food drives. They collected money and clothing. And even the leaders of the Democratic Association of Quincy tried to help the church gain redress from Missouri. In fact, at one point in the Quincy Whig, which was their local newspaper, it says, a large number of families are encamped on the opposite bank of the Mississippi, waiting for an opportunity to cross. If they have been thrown upon our shores destitute through the oppressive people of Missouri, common humanity must oblige us to aid and relieve them, all in our power. So, naturally, since there was people willing to help, a lot of the Mormons were coming to Quincy. They were working their way there. Now, there was more or less 8,000 to 10,000 Latter-day Saints who migrated to western Illinois over the next couple of years. A lot of these people were coming out of Missouri, coming out of Ohio, right here in the beginning, right at the get-go. They're coming out of Missouri and they're ending up in Quincy. Now, to give you an idea of the scale there, I looked up Chicago, and in 1840, Chicago was the 92nd most populous city in the United States, and it had a population of about 4,000. So, granted, it grew very rapidly uh, in the years following that. But just to give you an idea of the scale, now not all 8 or 10,000 of these Mormons were coming over right now, but there was a huge volume that were coming over. And so, of course, the community of Quincy could not accommodate them all. And so many people were forced into surrounding farmlands, adjoining counties, wherever they could find a place to stay. Anybody who would let them, sleep in the barn or set up camp in their fields or whatever. It was wintertime, it was frozen, and they had nowhere to go. And so these, you can just imagine the picture in your mind, all of these Mormon refugees coming out of Missouri in the middle of winter. They don't know where they're going. They kind of left in a hurry, couldn't really pack all that well. They're getting to Quincy, a place where people are friendly to them and willing to help. And so they're just scattering out wherever they can. They're just ending up in barns, in fields. If somebody's got a spare bed, they might end up in there with no real idea of what's going to happen next, of what the future holds for them. And through all of this, where's Joseph Smith? Well, he's in Liberty Jail. So you can imagine on both sides, Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail, getting little tidbits of information here and there, whether through jeers from the guards or letters that are coming in. He's hearing about the people all scattered and scattering and nowhere to go and no real solid leadership, so to speak. Um, so you can imagine how that weighed on his mind. But then at the same time, think about the Mormons. They came to Missouri. This was Zion, right? They were gonna build a temple to God, and they were gonna make Zion in Missouri, and it culminated in a war that they lost. And their leader, their prophet Joseph Smith, is in jail, and they don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. They're just um, working their way east, trying to get away from the extermination order from the Missourians, and no real idea of what's going to happen to Joseph Smith or what the future holds. And so they were more or less wanderers, right? But they were also others. The Battle of Crooked River was a skirmish between Latter-day Saint forces and a Missouri State militia in late October in 1838, and it was one of the principal points of conflict in the Mormon War, the Missouri Mormon War. Um, and the veterans of Crooked River were in trouble. And so in Far West, the leaders who were there, um, Brigham Young, Hiram, warned them, and they said, "You guys got to get out. You got to get out of here, because according to Hiram, what he said is, if found, they will be shot down like dogs." So the veterans of Crooked River took off from Far West, and they got lost. Literally, they became lost, and they ended up at the Des Moines River, just north of where it joined the Mississippi, where they happened to meet this gentleman, Isaac Galland. Now, this guy, fascinating guy, he'd done a lot of things in his life, ends up joining the church eventually, but at this point, he was a land speculator. We talked a couple weeks ago about land speculation at this time in the Kirtland Safety Society, and how Andrew Jackson was dealing with land speculation. Well, this guy, he had purchased large tracts of land, um, and when these veterans of Crooked River ran into him, he listened to their story and he offered to sell them um, some land. And so in February, the men took the information to the church leaders in Quincy, who were meeting and trying to decide what to do next. A handful of them, Sidney Rigdon, Edward Partridge, and others, said, "No, we don't want to gather to one place again. That was kind of the major source of our problems in Missouri and Ohio. We should not, you know, group together like we have in the past." Brigham Young, on the other hand, said no. He says, there's strength in numbers. We can help each other out, and so we should all have a gathering place that we can come to. But they didn't really know for sure what to do. There was different sides, so they wrote Joseph Smith a letter, he replied in late March and told them to buy the property and not to scatter. Um, so Joseph Smith, we talked last week about him being transferred out of Liberty Jail and the guards kind of turning their back and letting him go. So he spent, 4 or 5 months in Liberty Jail, and then he walks to Quincy, Illinois, where most of the people are gathered. And you would think maybe he wants a little R&R time at this point, but no. 2 days after getting there, he holds a council meeting, and the next day he's traveling north to meet Isaac Gallen and see the land he's got for sale. And so he makes arrangements with Isaac to purchase the land, goes back to Quincy, and calls a conference. He holds a general conference near Quincy on the 4th and 5th of May, where he told the saints what he had done, the land acquisition, and they all voted on it, right? By common consent. Everybody had their say, and the church sanctioned the land acquisition. So not long after that, in a public letter on July 1st, Joseph Smith called upon all saints everywhere to migrate to the new site. By summer's end, almost 21,000 acres had been acquired. The vast majority of that, about 20,000 acres, were acquired from Isaac Galland. Now, he had offered them very reasonable interest rates, long-term payments, so they were able to get into it without a lot of money out of pocket. Unfortunately, they never really were able to pay that off, but that's a story for a different day. So they acquire almost 21,000 acres, and the prophet named the new Illinois site Nauvoo. Now, it wasn't just Nauvoo was the city there. There actually used to be a town called Commerce. There was two towns in this lot. One was Commerce, one was Commerce City. They never really took off, and so Joseph Smith renamed Commerce to Nauvoo. Now, it wasn't just Nauvoo that the saints were gathering to. You can see here a little map. Nauvoo is right in that crook of the Mississippi River, near the top there. Across the river is Montrose, and then Zarahemla. They started up Mormon Springs, a bunch of these. Nauvoo at the time, at the beginning, was just a very small commerce, right? It was just a handful of houses and buildings. So many of the saints, when they arrived, they started draining the swamp. They lived in wagons, tents, dugouts. In Montrose, there happened to be empty military barracks left from the Black Hawk War, and so a bunch of people would stay in them. And the saints all had a gathering place. Now they had somewhere to go, but they were around this whole area. They weren't focused in Nauvoo because Nauvoo couldn't hold them, so they were all over, even in Carthage and other places. It's around the same time that Joseph Smith goes to Washington, D.C. to seek redress for what had happened in Missouri. And it's the quote that we've all heard where he goes to President Martin Van Buren, who says something along the lines of, "Your cause is just, but there's nothing I can do for you." Now, if we look at that from our point of view today, where the executive branch of the federal government wields a lot of power, we think that maybe Martin Van Buren was weak or maybe didn't really care. But this was a long time ago when the government didn't really work the way it did. The states' governments were very strong. The federal government was not. And so while Martin Van Buren was the president of the United States, it probably was very true that he didn't know what he could do for them. The federal government couldn't really come in and start telling state governments what to do. It wasn't until after the Civil War, which wasn't too long after this, but it wasn't until after the Civil War that the whole states' rights, federal government, that stuff all started coming into play then, whereas now the federal government was not the overreaching authority that it is today, where it extends its authority into many of the states. So with that, when Joseph gets back from Washington, D.C., there's some very serious discussions about the form of government that Nauvoo should have. They don't want a replay of what has happened in previous areas where they've been. And it's around this same time that John C. Bennett shows up in Nauvoo. Interesting book about this guy, John C. Bennett. It's called The Saintly Scoundrel. Worth the read if you've got the time. But it talks a lot about him. He was a very ambitious, energetic, charismatic guy. He had already been spent some time in Springfield, the capital of Illinois, won some friends in the government, and so as he shows up and gets in the circle of Joseph Smith, it's decided that he needs to help them write a charter, a Nauvoo charter, and they take it to Springfield, where on December 16, 1840, Illinois Governor Thomas Carlin and the legislature of Illinois sign it. And now, this charter, while it did give them far-reaching authority, it really wasn't all that different from many other charters. Like the charter at Chicago, Springfield itself had a charter similar to it. Um, and a lot of the politicians saw the Mormon population growing and looked at it as a voting bloc that they could win over, right? Illinois at this time was split pretty equally between the Democrats and the Whigs, and just like today, the politicians are pandering, trying to get some votes, and so um, a lot of the impetus to giving Nauvoo this charter was, I mean, not only was it the normal thing to do in those days, but it was also looking for their votes. And now there was also talk about the outrage and atrocities the Saints had suffered at the hands of their Missouri neighbors, and so the charter was granted. Now, church leaders were very pleased with its broad provisions, um, which seemed to ensure that government officials would no longer be able to take advantage of the Saints like they had in Missouri. It gave them a lot of power, a lot of legal powers, including they could organize a legislative body to create laws within the city. They could create the Nauvoo Legion as a subset of the state militia. They could establish a university. They could have judges and courts. Um, a lot of great potential there. Now, one of which we hear a lot about is the Nauvoo Legion. Now, the Nauvoo Legion, again, it's not like it is today. Every state had its own militia. Illinois had a militia. The Mormon War in Missouri, the Mormons were up against the state militia. So when the Nauvoo Charter gave them the ability to create the Nauvoo Legion, which would be a part of the state militia, of course the Mormons weren't going to waste any time, right? They had learned their lesson. Um, and it was the governor himself who appointed Joseph Smith as Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion. And so this was a government-sanctioned military body, and it quickly became quite large. So the everything that happened in Missouri was fresh in their minds. The fact that government had sanctioned it and given them the rights to do it, they were excited to get this going. So at its peak, it had around 2,500 troops, both in infantry and cavalry. Now that's a conservative estimate. I don't know that we really know, but as I was looking into this, I saw estimates everywhere from 2,500 to 5,000 troops. Now, you got to think about this because the U.S. Army at the time only had about 8,500 people. So the Nauvoo Legion was 30-40% of what the U.S. Army was at the time. So it was by far the largest military force in the West, and it was the second largest military force in the whole United States. So quite impactful to the region, to the Saints, to their security, their sense of security, etc. Around the same time, just like in Kirtland, Joseph Smith sent Heber C. Kimball on a mission. He went over to the British Isles. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. He had phenomenal success. And as a result of that initial success, once they get to Nauvoo and they start getting everything set up and things are coming along, Joseph sends most of the 12 to England to follow up on what Heber C. Kimball started. Now, interesting thing happened here. As you have good success in England and you have Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, you kind of have two doctrinal centers of the church. They don't have email, they don't have phone, they don't have satellite, they can't have web, video conferences. They didn't even have fax machines. We think of fax machines as archaic. They didn't even have that. All they had was letters that got mailed by boat. And so you have much of the 12 in England who are teaching. They start up a periodical called the Millennium Star. And they're writing long doctrinal treatises in the Millennial Star, and it's going out to all the saints in England. And they're doing that with no input or direction from Joseph Smith directly. And so Joseph Smith doesn't really know what they're teaching over there until months later when he gets copies of the Millennial Star delivered to them, and he can read these doctrinal treatises of what the people are talking about. Likewise, the flip side of that, Joseph Smith is in Nauvoo teaching, expounding doctrine, and the leaders in the British missions have no idea what he's talking about. And they don't hear about it until he writes them letters. Baptism for the dead, he started teaching that in Nauvoo. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the guys in Britain don't hear about it for months. They don't even know that this new doctrine has been revealed and is being taught in Nauvoo. So by 1846, 4,700 British converts had immigrated to Nauvoo, of about 18,000 baptized in England. And more come later on, but just by 1846 we have almost 5,000 of them who have come to Nauvoo. And I've heard it said, and there's no way to know, but I've heard it said that without this British mission that Joseph Smith sent these guys on, it's possible that the church would not have survived. There were a lot of new religions starting up at this time period, and a lot of them aren't around anymore. But with the influx of fresh blood of excited converts coming over from England, it gave the church the critical mass it needed, not only to survive the Nauvoo period, but survive the journey out west and give them enough people once they got out west to sustain themselves until they could get established. So this British mission that the 12 went on, Joseph sent the 12 on while in Nauvoo, was very critical and important, not only to the church at the time, but to the future of the church. Another amazing thing that happened in Nauvoo was Doctrine and Covenants, section 124. Now, it's interesting, when we look at the writings that we have of Joseph Smith, the vast majority of the existing accounts that we have of Joseph Smith's public sermons date from the Illinois period of church history. Most of the sermons, the public sermons, the speeches that Joseph Smith gave that we have record of, he gave while in Nauvoo. Now, the opposite is true of records of his revelations. Most of those don't come from the Nauvoo period. In the current edition of the Doctrine and Covenants that we have, 135 sections were written during Joseph Smith's lifetime, and only 9 of those date from the 5 years that the prophet lived in Nauvoo. If you look at the 1844 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, there's 110 sections canonized there. Only 3 date from the Illinois period. And though relatively few organizational or instructional revelations were recorded during the final years of Joseph Smith's life, this one is an exception. Received January 19th, 1841. It was the first documented revelation received at Nauvoo, and the first in almost 2 years. The previous documented revelation was the one we talked about a couple weeks ago while he was in Liberty Jail writing the letter that came, Doctrine and Covenants 1, 21, 22, 23. But this one, it identifies Nauvoo as a temple city. It was a fantastic thing to happen, and to a lot of the saints at the time, it was considered the Nauvoo revelation. Now, in the interest of time, we're not going to spend a lot of time on section 124. We're just going to basically talk about what's in there. There's a lot of things in there. It starts off telling Joseph to give a proclamation to the kings of the world about the gospel. There's some commendations of certain people. Hiram Smith is mentioned multiple times. William Law, John C. Bennett. There's a lot of people in there who get great compliments and instruction from the Lord. Baptism for the dead. That's the first time that we learn about that. There's a lot of organizational information about the priesthood and the organization of the church. There's discussion of temples in Missouri and Ohio, temples that the saints were supposed to build but didn't, and some text on that and what the Lord thinks of that. And then, of course, also there's the instruction to build a house unto my name. Now, the interesting thing is um, it's used twice, or it's used multiple times through the Revelation, but directed towards two specific buildings. The first is the Nauvoo house. The Lord says to build basically a hotel unto my name. It's the Nauvoo house. Now this building has a great history. It wasn't ever actually completed while the saints were in Nauvoo. They ended up taking resources away from it to complete the temple, but it's the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon was hidden in the cornerstone. Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith's bodies were hidden in the basement there after they were martyred to prevent them from being stolen. And Emma lived in this house. She lived the rest of her life in this house after the saints left Nauvoo. So interesting that the Lord would say to build a hotel, basically a house unto my name, a hotel. And then the other time, or the other mentions of a house unto my name in section 124, of course, are for the Nauvoo temple, which I think many people are aware of and know the stories of. So we're not going to talk too much about either of these because I want to focus on something else that happened in Nauvoo. Now, there is a quote I'd like to read from Dieter F. Uchtdorf from a talk that he gave in April 2014 entitled, "Are You Sleeping Through the Restoration?" He says, "Sometimes we think of the restoration of the gospel as something that is complete, already behind us. Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, he received priesthood keys, the church was organized. In reality, the restoration is an ongoing process. We are living in it right now. It includes all that God has revealed, all that he does now reveal, and the many great and important things that he will yet reveal. Brethren, the exciting developments of today are part of that long foretold period of preparation that will culminate in the glorious second coming of our Savior Jesus Christ." So when you listen to this quote, when you read what it says, don't you think that there's changes? There's going to be changes, right? We're living through a living restoration, right? So the church 20 years from now is not going to look like it does today. It doesn't look today like it did 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? So of course, the church today is not going to look like it did in Nauvoo. And we need to remember that as we go through these next few slides. Another quote that I wanted to read was from Spencer W. Kimball in the late 1970s. He said, "We know that women who have deep appreciation for the past will be concerned about shaping a righteous future." And Julie B. Beck, who was the General Relief Society president in a couple years ago, in 2011, she kicked off this thing where she wanted the year spent teaching about Relief Society history. Most of the visiting teaching messages in the Ensign that year were about history or included snippets about history. And she said, as she was explaining that in January of 2011, what they were going to do for that year, she said, "Understanding our history is not only important, but essential." And the emphasis there is in her original talk, where she says not only important, but essential. She emphasized essential in that January 2011 article that she wrote in the Ensign, talking about how that year the sisters would spend learning about the history of the Relief Society. So I guess you can probably, or you have probably guessed by now that it's one of the things I want to talk about here, because that is when the Relief Society started, is in the Nauvoo period. One last quote before we go on, from Daughters in My Kingdom. It says, "The history of the Relief Society teaches the divine identity and infinite worth of daughters of God. It is a spirit-filled story of strong, faithful, purposeful women who have served with little public recognition. Through a study of this history, Latter-day Saints can see that our Heavenly Father knows His daughters, that He loves them, that He trusts them with sacred responsibilities, and that He guides them as they fulfill those responsibilities." So most of what's going to come in the next few minutes was taken from the Nauvoo Relief Society Minute Book. This can be found online at the Joseph Smith Papers website. I would really recommend anybody sit down and read it. As I was putting this lesson together, I couldn't put it down. Well, I guess not put it down. It was on the screen in front of me, but I couldn't stop reading it. It was fascinating to read the formation of the Relief Society in Nauvoo and the discussions that they had in the minutes for each of their meetings. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the formation of the Relief Society. Now, all early Latter-day Saints were focused on building Zion, and temples were seen to be a big part of that. So everyone wanted to help with the Nauvoo temple, right? They had just got to Nauvoo, and Nauvoo, there was a little bit different spirit in the air. When they were in Kirtland, they were kind of expecting the end to come, right? The end is near. The end is near. They weren't really planning on being there for a long time because they thought that the second coming was right around the corner. We talked a couple weeks ago how at one point after the temple was dedicated, many people actually thought the millennium had already come. Nauvoo was a little different. They were there for the long haul. They were building brick houses. They were doing things in such a way that they could stay in Nauvoo for a long time. And all of the residents, men and women, they all wanted to help and get the temple done. And so Margaret Cook suggested that she could provide needlework to help support those physically building the temple. Sarah Kimball, Margaret Cook was Sarah Kimball's seamstress, and Sarah offered material to help her. Now, the picture on the top is Sarah Kimball, and try as I might, I could not find a picture of Margaret Cook, and so that's why we just have a silhouette there. But the two ladies talked about it, and they thought, we'll start a sewing society to benefit the temple. This was not uncommon in the early days of our country, especially on the frontier and the far western reaches of it. A lot of women would get together, start grange societies, start sewing societies, things like that. And they were pretty official. They had bylaws, they had presidents, they had, Robert's Rules of Engagements or whatever they called it. And so the following Thursday, about a dozen of the neighboring sisters met together in Sarah's home to discuss the formation of a sewing society to help benefit the work of the Lord there in Nauvoo. Now they took the bylaws that they had written and the idea to Joseph Smith, and they said, hey, we want you to sanction this. And he read through it, and he said something along the lines of, this is the best I have ever seen, but the Lord has something better. Meet me next Thursday at the Masonic Hall, and we will, and I'll tell you about it. Now, the Masonic Hall was also the Red Brick Store, which was also Joseph Smith's office, right? It was one building that served multiple purposes. But the following Thursday, excuse me, the next March 17th, 1842, a date that will be that's mostly well known to most Relief Society sisters, 20 women gathered together at the Red Brick Store with Joseph Smith and two early apostles to learn what the Lord had that was better than what they had given Joseph Smith, that he said was the best they had ever seen. And so when they all get in there, Joseph Smith proposed that they select among themselves a presiding officer, and that whomever they select should choose two counselors. And so it was motioned by Sister Whitney and seconded by Sister Packer that Emma Smith be chosen president. And the motion passed unanimously. So once Emma Smith had been chosen as president, Joseph proposed that she choose her counselors. And then he said that they may be ordained to preside over this society in taking care of the poor, administering to their wants, and attending to the various affairs of this institution. So according to the Nauvoo Relief Society Minute Book, the presidentress-elect then made choice of Sarah M. Cleveland and Mrs. Elizabeth Ann Whitney for counselors. After that was done, Joseph dismissed his two apostles from the stand, invited the ladies up to sit up there, and he read the revelation to Emma from the 25th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. This is the revelation that was received 12 years prior that said Emma was an elect lady. And Joseph stated that she was ordained at the time to expound the scriptures to all and to teach, but not she alone. Other women may attain to the same blessings. So they have their leadership. They have Emma as president. They've selected her among themselves, and she's chosen her counselors. So now they need a name, right? So after some discussions, the sisters decided to call themselves the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo. The name was first suggested by Sarah M. Cleveland and was quickly seconded by Elizabeth Ann Whitney. Now, John Taylor, one of the apostles that was there with Joseph Smith, stood up and said, I'd like to offer an amendment that it be called the Nauvoo Female Benevolent Society, which he believed would give it a more definite and extended idea of the institution. While Councillor Cleveland did second it, the motion did not pass. And Emma suggested that she would like an argument with Elder Taylor on the words relief and benevolence. The popularity of the word benevolent was one great objection, because no person can think of the word without thinking of corrupt institutions of the day, and Emma did not wish to have it called after other societies in the world. The popular institutions of the day should not be our guide. That as daughters of Zion we should set an example for all the world, rather than confine ourselves to the course which had been heretofore pursued. Um, so as mentioned, there was benevolent societies were somewhat common, and obviously Emma has an issue. She doesn't want to be a benevolent society because there was, some corruption maybe with some of the ones that she was familiar with. But there was also an objection to using the word relief. The idea was that it associated with some great calamity, and that they intended appropriating on some extraordinary occasions instead of meeting the common occurrence. To which Emma replied, "We are going to do something extraordinary. When a boat is stuck on the rapids with a multitude of Mormons on board, we shall consider that a loud call for relief. We expect extraordinary occasions and pressing calls." At which point, I believe it was Elder Taylor who called for the meeting to be adjourned. And Joseph Smith denied that, said, nope, we're not going to adjourn. We're going to finish this out. And so the meeting went on, and eventually Elder Taylor arose and said, "I shall have to concede the point. Your arguments are so potent, I cannot stand before them. I shall have to give way." And so it was called the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo. Now, Joseph Smith told them, to do their thing, to teach and expound, like he said at the beginning, we quoted, and to offer relief. And if they ever needed any help or advice, he was there for them. 6 weeks later, he met with the sisters again, and he said, "This society is to get instruction through the order which God has established, through the medium of those appointed to lead. And I now turn the key to you in the name of God, and this society shall rejoice, and knowledge and intelligence shall flow down from this time. This is the beginning of better days to this society." Now, the Relief Society in Nauvoo had grown and was growing very rapidly. At the time, you actually had to request to join, and you had to petition the members, and you were accepted based on your goodness and virtue, and it actually came with a little fee to join. But by August of 1842, nearly 1,100 women had joined the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo. Now, at their meetings, they didn't just, it wasn't a sewing circle like maybe initially they had planned, where Sarah Kimball and Margaret Cook were going to sew things for the workers on the temple. There was actually a lot of spiritual gifts that were received and practiced at these meetings, including speaking in tongues and healing the sick. They were openly practiced by the Relief Society. Emma and her counselors frequently laid hands on the sick and blessed them that they might be healed. So not only were they doing charitable things, but they were also teaching each other and expounding to each other and practicing spiritual gifts. It was, at this time, it's important to remember that the church was very different than it is now. It wasn't quite as organized, and so the Relief Society was the women's society, while the priesthood was the men's society, and they did a lot of things that the priesthood also did. Now, you could imagine that maybe some people were concerned with some of this, and there's no real records that I could find of somebody complaining about it. But at the sixth meeting of the Relief Society, Joseph Smith did address it. He spoke to them of the Apostle Paul's teachings in 1 Corinthians about the gifts of the Spirit, and he emphasized that these signs, such as healing the sick, casting out devils, etc., should follow all that believe, whether male or female. It is the privilege of those set apart to administer in that authority which is conferred on them. And if the sisters should have faith to heal the sick, let all hold their tongues, and let everything roll on. And then a little while later, he said, respecting the female laying on hands, there could be no devils in it if God gave his sanction by healing. That there could be no more sin in any female laying hands on the sick than in wetting the face with water. That it is no sin for anybody to do that has faith. Do it that has faith. Or if the sick has faith to be healed by the administration. So Joseph directly addressed those at the sixth meeting of the Relief Society, which is great because now we have his words addressing them, talking about it. But of course, the Relief Society did also do what they set out to do, giving relief to temple workers. There was one meeting, you can read the minutes, where they're asking women, what can you do to help out? And one says she'll go solicit material. I'll board somebody who's working on the temple. Another says, I'll go abroad with a wagon and collect wool, etc., for the purpose of forwarding the work. Another says, I'll give a portion of my time, any portion of my time, or all of my time. And another one says, I'll do anything. I'll knit, I'll sew, I'll wait on the sick, whatever will be most useful. And there's more and more. I mean, there's lots of women who are just offering up ways that they could help further the work of the Nauvoo temple. And now we have in the minute book most of the minutes of their meetings. Joseph Smith addressed the women 6 times in that first year. He taught principles that helped Relief Society sisters relieve the poor and save souls, foundational principles upon which the society was built. But there was additional teachings as well, including instructions regarding women's new responsibilities, authority, forthcoming temple blessings, and also the minutes also documented donations for and visits with the poor, donations for temple construction, women's efforts at moral and civic activism. The record also contains references to the difficulties and hardships the saints faced during that time period. So it's a great window into a day in the life, so to speak. This is kind of the first, though it wasn't called it, the first real implementation of some sort of visiting teaching type program. But unfortunately, tensions in Nauvoo led to the discontinuation of the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo in March of 1844. And it was over a decade before Relief Society meetings resumed again in the Salt Lake Valley. So, in closing, another quote from Daughters in My Kingdom. It is important to remember that while the women of the First Relief Society were taught powerfully by their beloved prophet, they taught powerfully themselves too, and they acted out their mission, which remains our mission, to provide relief for those in need. Now, going back to the manual, the purpose of this week's lesson is to teach about how the early saints worked to build the kingdom of God in Nauvoo and to encourage class members to follow their example. Nauvoo, while a relatively short period of time in the grand scheme of things, there was a lot of stuff going on, way more than we could ever even hope to scratch the surface of in a 45-minute gospel doctrine lesson. But if we really are to understand about how the early saints worked to build the kingdom of God in Nauvoo and try to follow their example, I think the Relief Society is probably one of the best places to start the formation of the Relief Society, what those sisters did, how they did it, their pure motives and their activities while they were there. And so I would encourage everybody, it's all online at the Joseph Smith Papers, the the minute book from the Relief Society meetings there in Nauvoo. It's a great read. It's an easy read, and it's very informative and uplifting. And so with that, we're done. So thank you.